Everyone was afraid of the millionaire in the house, until the new cleaning lady silenced him in front of everyone. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The rain hammered against the windshield of Rachel Montgomery's 20-year-old Honda Civic as she navigated through the winding roads of Buckhead, Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhood. Her weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she passed mansion after mansion, each one more imposing than the last. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just 6 months ago, she'd been scraping together quarters to buy groceries in Hickson, Tennessee, a forgotten speck on the map nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Turn right in 200 feet onto Habersham Road, the GPS announced in its mechanical voice, barely audible over the storm. Rachel squinted through the rain-streaked glass, her heart pounding as she spotted the address, 4127 Habersham Road, the Hawthorne Estate. The wrought iron gates stood 12 feet tall, adorned with an elaborate H monogram that seemed to sneer down at her rusted Honda. Rachel pressed the intercom button with a trembling finger, acutely aware of how her mountain accent would sound to whoever answered. "Montgomery for Mr. Hawthorne," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The gates swung open with mechanical precision, revealing a circular driveway that could have housed her entire childhood home. Ancient oak trees lined the path like sentinels, their Spanish moss swaying ominously in the March wind. The mansion itself was a testament to old Southern money. 3 stories of pristine white columns, wraparound porches, and windows that gleamed like watchful eyes. Rachel parked behind a sleek black Mercedes, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the duct tape holding her side mirror in place. She grabbed her worn leather purse, the same one her mother had carried to church every Sunday for 30 years, and made a dash through the rain to the imposing front door. Before she could knock, the door opened to reveal a tall, thin woman in her 60s. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her navy dress looked like it cost more than Rachel's monthly rent back home. "Ms. Montgomery, I presume?" The woman's voice carried the refined drawl of old Atlanta money. "I'm Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, the estate manager. You're precisely on time despite this dreadful weather." Rachel stepped into the foyer and immediately felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. The ceiling soared 20 feet above, dominated by a crystal chandelier that cast rainbows across walls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. Italian marble floors stretched in every direction, so polished she could see her reflection, a woman in her early 50s with premature gray streaks in her auburn hair, wearing her best suit from Walmart. "Mr. Hawthorne is waiting in his study," Mrs. Whitmore said, her heels clicking against the marble as she led Rachel through a maze of corridors. "I trust Premier's staffing agency briefed you on the unique requirements of this position?" Rachel nodded, though her mind raced with questions. The agency had been mysteriously vague about her duties, mentioning only that she'd be a personal assistant to a prominent businessman, with a salary that seemed too good to be true, $75,000 a year, more money than she'd ever dreamed of earning. They passed through a living room that looked like a museum exhibit, complete with velvet ropes that seemed to warn, "Don't touch anything." Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Hawthornes staring down with the same piercing blue eyes and aristocratic jawlines. Rachel caught a glimpse of a more recent photo, a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and those same intense blue eyes, standing beside an elegant blonde woman and 2 adult children. "That's Mr. Hawthorne with his family." Mrs. Whitmore noticed her gaze. "Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, their daughter Victoria. She's an architect in New York, and their son Marcus. Well, he lives here as well." Something in her tone suggested there was more to that story, but before Rachel could process it further, they reached a set of heavy oak doors. "Sir," Mrs. Whitmore knocked softly. "Ms. Montgomery has arrived." "Send her in," came a gruff voice from within. Rachel stepped into the study, and her breath caught in her throat. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat William Hawthorne himself. He was exactly as imposing as his portrait suggested, tall even while seated, with silver hair combed back and sharp features that spoke of generations of privilege. He wore an expensive navy suit that probably cost more than her car, and his hands were clasped formally on the desk. But something was off. His piercing blue eyes, which had seemed so intense in the photographs, stared straight ahead without focusing on her face. "Ms. Montgomery," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I understand you come highly recommended from Premier Staffing." "Yes, sir. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Hawthorne." Rachel approached the desk, noting how his gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing vaguely toward a leather chair across from his desk. "Tell me about yourself. And speak up. I don't have time for mumbling." Rachel settled into the chair, which was so plush it seemed to swallow her whole. "Well, sir, I've spent the last 15 years caring for my mother, who had Alzheimer's. Before that, I worked various jobs, retail, cleaning services, a brief stint at a local bank. I know I don't have traditional office experience, but you cared for someone with Alzheimer's?" He leaned forward slightly, and for just a moment, his authoritative mask slipped. "That requires patience." "Yes, sir. Patience and understanding. And creativity, finding new ways to communicate when the old ways stop working." Something shifted in his expression, so subtle she almost missed it. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that seemed oddly nervous for such a commanding man. "Your duties will include managing my schedule, handling correspondence, and assisting with daily tasks as needed. Can you handle confidentiality, Ms. Montgomery? This household values privacy above all else." "Absolutely, sir. I understand the importance of discretion." He nodded curtly, then did something that made Rachel's heart skip. He reached for a pen on his desk, his hand sweeping the surface in a subtle, searching motion before his fingers closed around it. The gesture was so quick, so practiced, that she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. "Mrs. Whitmore will show you to your quarters and explain the household rules. You'll start tomorrow at 7 sharp. Don't be late, don't ask unnecessary questions, and don't interfere with family matters. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." As Rachel rose from her chair, she caught sight of something that made her stomach clench, a white cane, tucked discreetly behind his desk, almost hidden by the shadows. Her mind raced back to his unfocused gaze, the way he'd searched for the pen, how he'd gestured vaguely when telling her to sit. William Hawthorne, the most powerful real estate mogul in Georgia, was blind, and from the elaborate charade she'd just witnessed, he was determined that no one would ever know. "Mrs. Whitmore will escort you out," he said dismissively, already turning his attention to papers on his desk, papers that Rachel now realized he couldn't possibly read. As she left the study, her mind reeled with implications. She'd taken this job out of desperation, needing the money to start over after her mother's death. But now she found herself at the center of what was clearly a massive deception, working for a man whose pride ran so deep he'd rather live a lie than admit to any weakness. The rain had stopped by the time Mrs. Whitmore walked her to the door, but Rachel barely noticed. She had stepped into something far more complicated than a simple assistant position. She'd entered a world of secrets, where nothing was as it seemed, and where her own moral compass would soon be tested in ways she never could have imagined. As she drove away from the Hawthorne estate, Rachel caught one last glimpse of the mansion in her rearview mirror. In just 24 hours, she would return to begin what would become the most transformative year of her life, for both herself and the powerful family, whose carefully constructed world was about to be forever changed by a woman from the mountains who refused to look the other way. Rachel's alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., cutting through the darkness of her cramped studio apartment in East Atlanta. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of yesterday's encounter with William Hawthorne. The image of that white cane hidden behind his desk haunted her thoughts like a secret too heavy to bear. She dressed carefully in her second-best outfit, a charcoal gray pantsuit she'd bought at a thrift store in Chattanooga, and applied makeup with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. The drive back to Buckhead felt different in the morning light. The mansions looked less intimidating, more like elaborate stage sets waiting for their actors to emerge. The Hawthorne estate's gates opened before she could announce herself, as if someone had been watching for her arrival. This time, she parked in the designated staff area behind the main house, next to a row of pristine vehicles that probably cost more than most people's homes. Mrs. Whitmore met her at the servants' entrance, her expression as perfectly composed as it had been the day before. "Good morning, Ms. Montgomery. I trust you found your way without difficulty." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Follow me. I'll give you a proper tour before Mr. Hawthorne begins his day." They entered through a mudroom that was larger than Rachel's entire apartment, complete with built-in cubbies, a marble sink, and hooks that held umbrellas worth more than her monthly grocery budget. The back corridors of the house were a different world from the grand foyer she'd seen yesterday. Functional, pristine, but unmistakably designed for the help to move invisibly through the mansion. "The Hawthorne family has maintained this estate for 43 years, Mrs. Whitmore explained as they walked. Mr. Hawthorne built his empire from nothing, started with a single apartment building in downtown Atlanta, and now owns half the commercial real estate from here to Savannah. He expects excellence in all things, Ms. Montgomery. Perfection is not negotiable." They passed a massive kitchen where 2 uniformed staff members were already preparing breakfast. A Hispanic woman in her 40s looked up nervously as they passed, her eyes darting between Rachel and Mrs. Whitmore. "That's Maria, our head cook," Mrs. Whitmore whispered. "She's been with the family for 12 years. Speaks perfect English, but Mr. Hawthorne prefers she communicate through me. He values structure." Rachel's stomach twisted. The more she learned about this place, the more it felt like stepping back in time to an era she'd hoped America had left behind. They climbed a narrow back staircase to the second floor, emerging into a hallway lined with family portraits. Mrs. Whitmore paused in front of a formal family photograph from what looked like Christmas several years ago. "Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne," she said, pointing to the elegant blonde woman standing beside William. "She manages the family's charitable obligations and social calendar. Victoria, their daughter, lives in Manhattan now. She's quite successful in her own right. And Marcus?" She hesitated. "Marcus is 28 and still finding his place in the family business." The way she said it made it clear that Marcus was considered the family disappointment. "The family dynamics can be complex," Mrs. Whitmore continued as they approached a door marked "Private Office." "Mr. Hawthorne has very specific ways of doing things. He doesn't tolerate questions about his methods or decisions. Your job is to facilitate, not to understand. Are we clear?" Before Rachel could respond, a voice boomed from behind the office door. "Whitmore, where the hell is my morning briefing? I don't pay you to socialize with the help." Mrs. Whitmore's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked like fear. "Coming, sir." She turned to Rachel. "Wait here. Don't move, don't touch anything, and don't speak unless spoken to." The office door opened, and Rachel got her first glimpse of William Hawthorne in his natural habitat. He sat behind his massive desk like a king on his throne, but she immediately noticed the subtle signs she'd missed yesterday. His coffee cup sat in exactly the same spot as before, clearly a fixed reference point. His papers were arranged in precise stacks, each document in the same position. And his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, stared at a point about 3 feet to the left of Mrs. Whitmore's actual location. "Sir, this is Ms. Montgomery, your new assistant," Mrs. Whitmore announced. "I can see that," he snapped, though of course, he couldn't see anything at all. "Montgomery, sit down. We have work to do." Rachel took the same leather chair from yesterday, watching as William's hand moved across his desk with practiced precision, finding a folder exactly where he expected it to be. "Your first task is simple," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I need you to review these contracts and summarize the key points. Can you handle that? Or did Premier Staffing send me another incompetent fool?" He pushed the folder toward her, and Rachel opened it to find a stack of legal documents written in dense legalese. Her heart sank. She'd never dealt with contracts this complex before. But as she began to read, she noticed something odd. Every page had been marked with tiny braille dots along the margins, so small they were nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. "Sir," she said carefully, "would you like me to read these aloud as I review them?" His head snapped up, and for a moment, his mask of control faltered. "Why would you suggest that?" "Sometimes it helps to hear things out loud. Different perspectives, you know. My mother always said 2 minds are better than 1. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Rachel could hear her own heartbeat, wondering if she'd pushed too far too soon. "Fine," he said finally. "But keep your voice down. I don't need the entire household listening to my business affairs." As Rachel began to read the first contract aloud, she watched William's face carefully. His expressions shifted subtly with each clause, a slight frown at unfavorable terms, a barely perceptible nod at acceptable conditions. He was following every word, his sharp mind clearly intact despite his physical limitations. Halfway through the second document, the office door burst open without warning. A young man in his late 20s stumbled in, his dark hair disheveled and his expensive clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. "Dad, we need to talk," the young man said, his words slightly slurred. "The Patterson deal. I've been looking at the numbers, and I think you're making a mistake." "Marcus." William's voice could have frozen fire. "You're drunk. Again. Get out of my office." "I'm not drunk." "Well, maybe a little, but that's not the point. The Patterson property, it's sitting on top of a former gas station. The environmental remediation costs alone will." I said get out. William's fist slammed against the desk, sending papers flying. "You think because you took a few business classes at that third-rate college, you can waltz in here and question my decisions? I was building empires before you were born." Marcus's face crumpled, and Rachel saw something heartbreaking in his expression, the desperate need for his father's approval warring with his own sense of self-worth. "You never listened to me," Marcus said quietly. "You never even try to understand that I might have something valuable to contribute. I'm not the failure you think I am, Dad. You're my son," William said coldly. "That doesn't give you the right to embarrass me in front of employees. Leave. Now." Marcus looked at Rachel for the first time, his eyes filled with shame and rage. "I'm sorry you had to see this," he said to her. "Welcome to the Hawthorne family circus. Hope you last longer than the previous 3 assistants." He left, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. William sat in the aftermath of the confrontation, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to reorganize the scattered papers. Rachel watched him struggle for a moment before gently gathering the documents and placing them back in their precise arrangement. "Sir," she said softly, "about the Patterson property. Would you like me to research the environmental history? It might be worth looking into." He stared at her, or rather, stared through her, for a long moment. "You think my son is right?" "I think," Rachel said carefully, choosing her words like stepping stones across a dangerous river, "that good information never hurt anybody, even if it confirms what you already know." For the first time since she'd met him, William Hawthorne smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, more like the grimace of a man who'd forgotten how the expression was supposed to work, but it was something. "Very well, Montgomery. Research the Patterson property, but keep it between us. I won't have the staff thinking I need my son's advice to run my own business." "Of course, sir." Complete confidentiality. As the morning wore on, Rachel began to understand the intricate dance required to work in the Hawthorne household. Every interaction was a carefully choreographed performance designed to maintain the illusion of William's complete control. But beneath the surface, she could sense the cracks forming in the facade, a family slowly tearing itself apart under the weight of pride, secrets, and the desperate need to appear perfect to the outside world. By lunchtime, Rachel had already decided 2 things. She was going to keep this job, no matter how challenging it became, and somehow, some way, she was going to find a way to help this broken family heal, even if they didn't yet realize they needed her help. The real question was whether she could do it without destroying herself in the process. 2 weeks into her employment at the Hawthorne estate, Rachel had developed a routine that felt like walking a tightrope blindfolded. Every morning at precisely 7 a.m., she would enter William's study with his coffee, black, no sugar, served in the same bone china cup that had belonged to his grandfather. Every afternoon at 2 p.m., she would read him the financial reports, carefully modulating her voice to match his expectations. And every evening at 6 p.m., she would organize his desk exactly as he needed it, each item in its designated place like pieces on a chessboard. But it was the moments between the routine that haunted her. On this particular Thursday morning, Rachel arrived to find the study door slightly ajar. Through the crack, she could hear William's voice, low and urgent, speaking into his phone. "I don't care what it costs, Henderson. The shareholders cannot find out. If word gets out about my condition, the stock price will crater overnight. Do you understand me?" Rachel froze in the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should walk away. She should pretend she hadn't heard anything. but something rooted her to the spot. 2 years, William continued, his voice cracking with exhaustion. I've been managing this charade for 2 years, and I'll be damned if I let it fall apart now. The company employs 300 people. Their livelihoods depend on maintaining confidence in my leadership. The phone call ended abruptly, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the wall, probably a paperweight or a book. Rachel knocked softly and entered, pretending she'd just arrived. Good morning, sir. Your coffee. William sat rigidly behind his desk, his face a mask of composed authority, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for the cup. Montgomery, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I need you to call my physician, Dr. Matthews. Tell him I need to see him today. Private consultation. Of course, sir. Should I schedule it here or at his office? Here. And Montgomery, his piercing gaze fixed on a point somewhere near her left ear. This conversation never happened. Are we clear? Crystal clear, sir. As Rachel made the appointment, her mind raced with questions she couldn't ask. How had he lost his sight? When exactly had it happened? And most importantly, how many people knew the truth? The answer to the last question became clearer that afternoon when Dr. Matthews arrived. Rachel escorted the elderly physician to the study, noting how he moved through the mansion with the familiarity of someone who'd been visiting for years. William, Dr. Matthews said warmly as he entered the study. How are you holding up? Like hell, if you must know. The headaches are getting worse, and yesterday I nearly walked into the dining room table. Eleanor's starting to ask questions. Rachel lingered in the doorway, uncertain whether to stay or go. Ms. Montgomery, Dr. Matthews turned to her with kind eyes. William has told me about you. I understand you've been invaluable in helping maintain his independence. The weight of being acknowledged as part of the conspiracy settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She was no longer just witnessing the deception. She was actively participating in it. The progression is exactly what we expected, Dr. Matthews continued, opening his medical bag. The optic nerve damage from the stroke was severe. You've adapted remarkably well, considering. Stroke. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. William Hawthorne, the most powerful businessman in Georgia, had suffered a stroke that left him completely blind, and he'd hidden it from the world for 2 years. I need options, Matthews. Something, anything that might restore even partial vision. I can't keep this up much longer. William, we've been through this. The damage is irreversible, but you're managing better than most patients in your situation. You have an exceptional support system now. He glanced meaningfully at Rachel. After Dr. Matthews left, Rachel found herself alone with William in a silence that felt different, heavier, more honest somehow. So now you know, he said quietly. The great William Hawthorne is just a blind, old man playing pretend. Sir, I don't. His voice cut through her attempt at reassurance. Don't give me platitudes about how I'm still the same person. Don't tell me that blindness doesn't define me. And for God's sake, don't look at me with pity. Rachel studied his face, the proud set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders back despite the invisible weight pressing down on him. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw past the tyrannical employer to the frightened man underneath. I wasn't going to say any of those things, sir. He looked surprised. No? I was going to ask if you've ever considered that maybe your family would surprise you. Maybe they're stronger than you think. The silence that followed was so complete that Rachel could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting off seconds like a heartbeat. My family, William said finally, his voice bitter with years of accumulated disappointment, sees me as their meal ticket. Eleanor married me for my money and connections. Victoria respects my achievements, but lives 3 states away to avoid dealing with me personally. And Marcus sees me as an obstacle to his own ambitions. Or maybe, Rachel said carefully, they see you as someone who never needed their help before, so they don't know how to offer it now. Before William could respond, the study door opened, and Eleanor Hawthorne glided in like a vision from Southern Living magazine. Even at 55, she was stunning, blonde hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and pearls that probably cost more than Rachel's annual salary back in Tennessee. Darling, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the musical quality of old Atlanta money. I wanted to remind you about the Patterson reception tonight. The mayor will be there, along with half the city council. Rachel watched William's face carefully. She saw the micro-expressions of panic he tried to hide, the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible intake of breath. "Of course," he said smoothly. "The Patterson reception. 7 o'clock. 8, actually." "And William?" Eleanor moved closer to his desk, and Rachel noticed how her husband's hands subtly shifted to rest in positions where he could easily locate his commonly used items. "Are you feeling well? You seem tired lately." "I'm fine, Eleanor. Just busy with the quarterly reports." Eleanor's gaze flicked to Rachel, and for just a moment, something passed between them, a flash of recognition, perhaps, or suspicion. Rachel had the unsettling feeling that Eleanor Hawthorne saw more than she let on. "Of course, darling. I'll have Jenkins prepare the car for 8. She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Ms. Montgomery? Perhaps you could help William select his tie tonight? He's been making some interesting choices lately." After Eleanor left, William sat motionless for several minutes, his face a study in controlled humiliation. "She knows," he said finally. "Sir, Eleanor, my wife. She knows something's wrong. She's too smart not to have noticed the signs." He laughed bitterly. "Interesting tie choices. Christ." Rachel found herself in the impossible position of wanting to comfort a man who would probably fire her for showing an ounce of sympathy. Instead, she made a practical suggestion. "Sir, what if I attended the reception tonight? As your assistant, to help with names and faces? It would look perfectly professional." William's head turned toward her voice, and for the first time since she'd known him, his expression held something that might have been gratitude. "That might be helpful, but you'll need appropriate attire. Something befitting the occasion." Rachel's heart sank. Her best dress was a simple black number from Target that she'd worn to her mother's funeral, hardly appropriate for mingling with Atlanta's elite. As if reading her thoughts, William reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a company credit card. "Take this. Buy something suitable. And Montgomery." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Thank you. I know this isn't what you signed up for." That evening, Rachel found herself standing in Nordstrom, feeling like an alien trying to decode the customs of another planet. With the help of a patient salesperson, she selected a navy blue cocktail dress that was elegant without being flashy, along with simple pearl earrings and low heels she could actually walk in. As she prepared to attend her first high society event as William Hawthorne's secret keeper, Rachel caught her reflection in the dressing room mirror. The woman staring back at her looked polished, professional, confident, nothing like the desperate widow who'd driven down from the mountains just a month ago. But beneath the surface, she was still the same person who'd spent 15 years caring for her ailing mother. The same person who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is helping someone maintain their dignity when everything else is falling apart. Tonight, she would step into a world of political power players and social climbers, where one wrong word could destroy a man's empire. And she would do everything in her power to protect the secret that was slowly eating William Hawthorne alive, even as she began to suspect that the secret was destroying not just him, but his entire family. The real question was how long they could all keep dancing around the truth before the music stopped. The Patterson reception was held at the Georgian Terrace Hotel, a historic landmark in Midtown Atlanta that reeked of old money and older secrets. Rachel sat in the back of the Hawthorne's black Mercedes as Jenkins, their longtime chauffeur, navigated through the evening traffic. William sat beside her, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit and the navy tie she'd helped him select, though she'd been careful to make him think the choice was entirely his own. "Remember," William said quietly, his voice barely audible over the car's purring engine, "you're here as my assistant. Stay close, but not too close. If someone asks why I need an assistant at a social function, tell them I'm considering some new investments and you're taking notes." "Understood, sir." "And Montgomery?" His hand found the door handle with practiced precision as the car slowed. "The mayor, Tom Bradley, has a tendency to approach from the left and shake hands immediately. He's loud, gregarious, thinks everyone is his best friend. Senator Williams will be there too. She's more reserved, prefers to be approached rather than doing the approaching." Rachel marveled at how he'd memorized these social patterns, creating a mental map of human behavior to navigate a world he could no longer see. The hotel's grand ballroom was a symphony of crystal chandeliers, marble columns, and enough political power to reshape the entire state of Georgia. Rachel estimated nearly 200 guests mingling beneath ceilings that soared 20 feet high, their conversations creating a low hum punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. William. The booming voice belonged to a heavy-set man in his 60s who approached exactly as predicted, from the left, hand extended. Tom Bradley. Hell of a turnout tonight, don't you think? Tom. William responded smoothly, his hand meeting the mayor's with the confidence of someone who could see perfectly. Indeed, the Patterson development should be good for the city. Rachel positioned herself slightly behind and to William's right, close enough to whisper guidance if needed, but far enough away to maintain the illusion of professional distance. She watched the crowd like a hawk, noting faces, movements, potential obstacles in William's path. And who's this lovely lady? Mayor Bradley's attention turned to Rachel with the practiced charm of a career politician. Ms. Montgomery, my assistant, William said. She's helping me evaluate some new commercial opportunities. Pleasure to meet you, Ms. Montgomery. Always good to see William expanding his team. The mayor's handshake was firm, his smile genuine but calculating. Say, William, I wanted to discuss the zoning variance for your downtown project. Got a minute? As the two men launched into a discussion about municipal regulations, Rachel's attention was caught by a conversation happening nearby. Two women in expensive evening gowns were speaking in hushed tones, but their words carried clearly. I'm telling you, something's off about William Hawthorne, one woman said, her voice dripping with the kind of gossip that could destroy reputations. My husband's done business with him for 20 years, and lately, he's been different. Different how? The second woman asked. Evasive, delegating things he used to handle personally. And have you noticed he doesn't make eye contact anymore? Last month at the Chamber of Commerce dinner, he looked right through me. Rachel's blood turned to ice. These women were circling like vultures, sensing weakness without understanding its true nature. Mrs. Patterson, William's voice cut through her eavesdropping. A pleasure to see you again. Rachel turned to see an elegant woman in her 70s approaching, leaning heavily on an ornate walking stick. Mrs. Patterson was Atlanta royalty. Her family had owned half of Buckhead since before the Civil War. William, dear boy, Mrs. Patterson said warmly. I wanted to thank you personally for your investment in our little community center project. Your generous donation will make such a difference. William's face went blank for just a moment, a micro-expression of confusion that Rachel caught, but prayed no one else had noticed. He had no idea what donation Mrs. Patterson was referring to. The community center, Rachel whispered softly, stepping forward just enough to catch his attention. The one Mrs. Hawthorne arranged last month. Understanding flooded William's features, and he smiled smoothly. Of course, Eleanor handles our charitable giving, and she was quite moved by your presentation. We believe in investing in the community. Your wife is a treasure, Mrs. Patterson beamed. The way she's transformed that old warehouse into a safe space for underprivileged children, it's simply miraculous. You must be so proud. After Mrs. Patterson moved on, William leaned slightly toward Rachel. What the hell was she talking about? What warehouse? What community center? I don't know, sir. But it sounds like Mrs. Hawthorne has been making charitable donations in the family name. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll discuss this later. The evening continued with a parade of handshakes, small talk, and careful navigation through conversations laden with hidden meanings. Rachel found herself developing an almost supernatural awareness of William's needs, anticipating when he might need guidance, stepping in to provide context when necessary, all while maintaining the illusion that she was simply a dutiful assistant taking notes. It was during the dinner portion of the evening that everything nearly fell apart. Rachel had guided William to their assigned table, where they were seated with several prominent developers and their wives. The conversation flowed easily through the first two courses, touching on real estate trends, upcoming city council elections, and the eternal Atlanta traffic complaints. Then dessert arrived. William, said Charles Morrison, a competing developer who'd been eyeing Hawthorne properties for years, I've been meaning to ask you about the environmental reports on the Patterson site. Word is there might be some contamination issues that could affect the entire development timeline. Rachel felt William tense beside her. This was exactly the kind of detailed technical discussion that required visual references, documents, maps, specific data points that would be impossible to navigate without sight. The environmental surveys are comprehensive, William replied carefully. My team has been thorough in their analysis. Of course, Morrison continued, but there was something predatory in his smile. I'm sure your team is excellent. Though I have to say, you seem to be delegating more to your staff lately. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We all get older, after all. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Rachel could feel the other dinner guests listening more intently, sensing blood in the water. Charles, William's voice carried a dangerous edge. If you have something to say it directly. Nothing at all, old friend. Just an observation. You know how this business is. Perception matters as much as reality. Investors get nervous when they think leadership might be compromised in any way. Rachel watched William's hands clench beneath the table, his knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. Morrison was fishing, testing, probing for weakness like a shark sensing wounded prey. Gentlemen, Rachel interjected smoothly. If you'll excuse me, I need to make a quick call about tomorrow's site visit. Mr. Hawthorne, the Patterson environmental team wants to confirm the schedule for the soil samples. It was a complete fabrication, but it gave William a reason to end the conversation and provided an excuse for them to leave the table. As they walked toward the lobby, Rachel could feel eyes following them, whispers starting to circulate. How bad was that? William asked once they were alone in the hotel's ornate restroom. Morrison suspects something, but he doesn't know what. He's fishing. William leaned against the marble sink, his composure finally cracking. This is unsustainable, Montgomery. Every public appearance is a potential disaster. Every conversation is a minefield. Sir, maybe it's time to consider. No. His voice cut through her suggestion like a blade. I know what you're going to say, and the answer is no. This company is my life's work. I've built something that matters, something that employs hundreds of people and shapes this city's skyline. I won't let it crumble because of my personal limitations. Rachel studied his reflection in the ornate mirror, seeing not just a proud man refusing to admit weakness, but a human being trapped in a prison of his own making. What if there was another way? She asked quietly. What if we could find a solution that protected both you and the company? What are you talking about? I don't know yet. But there has to be something between total disclosure and this constant deception. Something that acknowledges your situation without destroying everything you've built. William was quiet for a long moment, his breathing the only sound in the marble-enclosed space. You're talking about trusting people, Montgomery. Trusting my family, my employees, my business partners. And in my experience, trust is the most dangerous luxury a successful man can afford. As they prepared to return to the reception, Rachel realized that William's blindness wasn't his only disability. He was also suffering from something far more debilitating. The complete inability to believe that anyone might love or respect him for who he was rather than what he could provide. The question was whether she could help him see that truth before his determination to hide his vulnerability destroyed everything and everyone he claimed to be protecting. The morning after the Patterson reception, Rachel arrived at the estate to find chaos barely contained behind the mansion's pristine facade. Raised voices echoed from the dining room, and Mrs. Whitmore met her at the servants' entrance with an expression that could have curdled milk. The family is having breakfast, Mrs. Whitmore said tersely. Mr. Hawthorne wants you in his study immediately, but I'd suggest waiting until the discussion concludes. Through the dining room's partially open door, Rachel could hear Eleanor's voice, crisp and controlled despite the obvious tension. William, I received 3 phone calls this morning about last night. Apparently, Charles Morrison is telling everyone who'll listen that you seemed off at dinner. Morrison's an ass who's been trying to undermine me for years. William's voice boomed back. I won't dignify his gossip with a response. Gossip? This was Victoria, William's daughter, her voice sharp with the precision of someone accustomed to cutting through corporate nonsense. Dad, I flew down here from New York because 3 different business contacts reached out to me with concerns about your recent behavior. This isn't gossip, it's a potential crisis. Rachel edged closer to the doorway, knowing she was eavesdropping but unable to resist the pull of this family drama that directly affected her own precarious position. Maybe if you'd actually visited more than twice a year, you'd understand how I conduct my business, William shot back. And maybe if you'd return my calls or respond to my emails about the quarterly projections, I wouldn't need to rely on secondhand information, Victoria replied coolly. Marcus's voice cut through the argument, slurred with what sounded like early morning drinking. Jesus Christ, you're all missing the point. Dad's been acting weird for months. Hell, for years. When's the last time any of us saw him actually read a document? When's the last time he drove himself anywhere? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus, you're drunk, Eleanor said quietly. Perhaps you should. I'm not drunk. Well, okay, maybe a little, but that doesn't make me wrong. Dad, when's the last time you looked me in the eye when we're talking? Actually looked at me? Rachel held her breath, waiting for William's response. The silence stretched so long she wondered if he'd somehow left the room. Finally, William's voice, deadly quiet. Get out. All of you. I have work to do. Dad, Victoria started. I said get out. Rachel heard chairs scraping against hardwood, footsteps moving in different directions, and Eleanor's voice, soft but carrying clearly. William, we need to talk. Really talk. Whatever's happening here, we can face it together. There's nothing to face, Eleanor. Nothing except a family that's forgotten how to respect the man who provides for them. More footsteps, then the sound of the dining room door closing with deliberate force. Rachel waited several minutes before knocking on William's study door. She found him standing by the window, his back to the room, hands clasped behind him in a posture that spoke of military discipline barely containing volcanic rage. Sir, they know, Montgomery. My own family knows something's wrong, and they're circling like vultures waiting for me to show weakness. Rachel set down his morning coffee and the day's correspondence, choosing her words carefully. Sir, perhaps they're not circling. Perhaps they're trying to help. He whirled around, his unseeing eyes blazing with fury. Help? You think Marcus, who can't stay sober past noon, wants to help? You think Victoria, who built her entire career on the opposite coast to get away from me, wants to help? You think Eleanor, who's been spending my money on secret charity projects I know nothing about, wants to help? The mention of Eleanor's charitable activities hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. About that, sir. The community center Mrs. Patterson mentioned last night. Yes, let's discuss that, shall we? William moved behind his desk with the careful precision Rachel had come to recognize. Find out exactly what my wife has been doing with company funds. How much, for how long, and what other surprises might be waiting for me. Sir, if I may suggest, maybe you could ask Mrs. Hawthorne directly? William's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Ask my wife. Montgomery, my wife and I haven't had an honest conversation in 20 years. Our marriage is a carefully orchestrated performance for the benefit of Atlanta society. We maintain separate bedrooms, separate social circles, and apparently, separate financial priorities. The revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. She'd observed the distance between William and Eleanor, but she'd assumed it was simply the natural formality of people who'd been married for decades. Then how do you know she's using company funds for charity? Because, William said wearily, Eleanor has never worked a day in her life. Every dollar she spends comes from my accounts, one way or another. The question is whether she's been writing checks without my knowledge or if someone's been forging my signature. A soft knock interrupted them. Eleanor entered without waiting for permission, looking every inch the Southern belle in a pale pink dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. William, we need to discuss last night, she said, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. Eleanor, this is neither the time nor the place. It's exactly the time and place. Eleanor's voice carried steel beneath the magnolia blossoms. Ms. Montgomery, would you give us some privacy, please? Rachel looked between them, sensing the potential for either breakthrough or catastrophe. Of course, Mrs. Hawthorne. I'll be in the library if you need me, sir. As she reached the door, Eleanor's voice stopped her. Actually, Ms. Montgomery, perhaps you should stay. You've become quite integral to my husband's daily routine, more than any previous assistant. The words were spoken pleasantly enough, but Rachel caught the undercurrent of suspicion and something that might have been jealousy. Eleanor, William started. No, William. For once, let me speak. Eleanor moved closer to his desk, her movements graceful despite the obvious tension. I've been married to you for 26 years. I know when you're hiding something from me. I know when you're afraid. And I know when you're in pain. William's face went ashen. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. The way you've stopped reading the newspaper at breakfast. The way you haven't driven yourself anywhere in 2 years. The way you've memorized every piece of furniture's location so precisely that you never bump into anything. Rachel felt like she was watching a dam burst in slow motion. The way, Eleanor continued, her voice now barely a whisper, you haven't really looked at me, really seen me, in so long that I've started to wonder if I'm disappearing. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. William sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. How long have you known? Known for certain? Since the stroke 2 years ago, when you spent 3 days in the hospital and swore the entire medical staff to secrecy. Suspected? Much longer. You think I didn't notice when you stopped commenting on my new dresses? When you stopped noticing when I changed my hair? When you stopped really seeing anything at all? Rachel stood frozen by the door, feeling like an intruder in this moment of raw honesty. Why didn't you say anything? William's voice was barely audible. Because I was waiting for you to trust me enough to tell me yourself. Eleanor's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. Because I thought if I just waited long enough, if I just loved you enough, you'd realize that you don't have to carry this burden alone. Eleanor, you don't understand. I understand that the man I married was so proud, so determined to be strong for everyone else, that he'd rather live in isolation than admit he might need help. I understand that you've been suffering in silence for 2 years while I've been suffering right alongside you. Both of us too stubborn to bridge the gap between us. William's hands shook as he reached across the desk, searching. Eleanor immediately moved forward, taking his hands in hers. The company, Eleanor. If this gets out, everything I've built will survive, she said firmly. Because it was built by a man of vision and determination, not by a man who happens to have perfect eyesight. Because you're still the same brilliant businessman you always were, just one who's learned to navigate the world differently. Rachel watched this reunion of two people who'd been married for decades but had forgotten how to see each other clearly. A blindness that had nothing to do with physical sight and everything to do with pride, fear, and the assumption that love means never showing weakness. There's something else, Eleanor said quietly. About the charitable donations. I've been using family money, not company funds, to support community projects. I should have told you, but I thought you'd forbid it because you'd see it as a sign of weakness or liberal sentimentality. How much? William asked. 200,000 over the past 3 years. Money from my trust fund, mostly, plus some from our joint personal accounts. William was quiet for a long moment. Tell me about the projects. After-school programs for underprivileged kids. A community center in an area where your company owns several apartment buildings. Job training programs for single mothers. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she described her work. I wanted to give back, William. We have so much, and there are people in this city struggling just to survive. You should have told me, William said, but his voice held no anger. I might have surprised you. Would you have approved? I might have suggested we double the amount. For the first time in the 3 weeks Rachel had worked for the Hawthorns, she saw something that looked like hope pass between husband and wife. But even as that small miracle unfolded, Rachel knew this was only the beginning. Victoria and Marcus were still circling with their own suspicions and resentments. The business community was starting to whisper, and somewhere out there, predators like Charles Morrison were sharpening their knives, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The foundation of the Hawthorne empire had been cracked for 2 years. The question was whether the family could repair those fractures before the entire structure came crashing down. 3 days after Eleanor's revelation, the Hawthorne household felt like a powder keg with a lit fuse. Rachel arrived Monday morning to find Victoria pacing in the front parlor, her cell phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the clipped, urgent tones of someone trying to manage a crisis from a distance. No, David, I don't care what the acquisition committee thinks about Dad's recent behavior. The Meridian deal goes forward as planned. What do you mean concerns about leadership stability? Who said that? Rachel tried to slip past unnoticed, but Victoria caught her eye and gestured for her to wait. The conversation continued for several more minutes, Victoria's expression growing darker with each exchange. Fine. Schedule the emergency board meeting for Thursday. But David, if I find out someone's been spreading rumors to manipulate stock prices, there will be consequences. She ended the call and turned to Rachel with the kind of laser focus that had made her one of New York's most sought-after commercial architects. Ms. Montgomery, isn't it? We haven't been properly introduced. I'm Victoria Hawthorne-Chin. Her handshake was firm, her gaze penetrating. I understand you've become quite indispensable to my father. I try to be helpful, Miss Hawthorne. Dr. Hawthorne, actually. And I'm sure you do. Victoria's smile was polite but cold. Tell me, in your professional opinion, how would you describe my father's current state of mind? The question was a minefield. Rachel chose her words carefully. Your father is a very determined man who takes his responsibilities seriously. That's a diplomatic non-answer if I ever heard one. Victoria moved closer, her voice dropping. Let me be direct. My father's business partners are questioning his judgment. His board of directors is nervous. And I just spent my weekend fielding calls from investors who think Hawthorne Industries might be vulnerable. Before Rachel could respond, Marcus stumbled into the parlor, looking like he'd slept in his clothes, if he'd slept at all. His dark hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled and stained, and the smell of bourbon preceded him like a toxic cologne. Well, Marcus said, his words only slightly slurred. If it isn't the golden child, come home to save the family empire. Marcus, you're drunk. Again. Victoria's voice carried the weary disappointment of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. I'm not drunk. I'm strategically impaired. There's a difference. Marcus collapsed into a leather armchair that probably cost more than most people's cars. And I'm not the one you should be worried about, Vicky. Dad's the one who's been acting like. Like what? The voice belonged to William, who appeared in the doorway with the silent precision Rachel had learned to expect. He was impeccably dressed as always, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself in the doorway where he could use the frame as a reference point. Dad. Victoria straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. I was just discussing some concerns that have been raised about my competence. William's voice was dangerously quiet. About my ability to run the company I built from nothing. The family faced off in the parlor like gunfighters at high noon, each waiting for someone else to draw first. Rachel found herself caught in the crossfire, a witness to decades of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Nobody's questioning your competence, Dad, Victoria said carefully. But there are questions about your recent decisions. The Patterson deal, for instance. The environmental reports suggest significant contamination that could cost millions in remediation. Marcus sat up straighter, suddenly more alert. I tried to tell you about that weeks ago. The property's sitting on top of an old gas station. The soil samples show petroleum contamination going down at least 15 feet. How do you know about soil samples? William demanded. Because I actually read the reports you ignore. Because I've been studying every deal, every contract, every investment this company makes, hoping someday you'd notice that I might actually have something to contribute. The raw pain in Marcus's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Rachel watched William's face, seeing him process not just the words but the emotion behind them. You've been reviewing confidential company documents? I've been trying to help, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. I've been trying to prove that I'm not the disappointment you think I am. The Patterson property is a disaster waiting to happen, but it's not the only one. The Brookhaven development has foundation issues. The downtown office complex needs a new HVAC system that'll cost $2 million. And the Riverside apartments. Enough. William's voice cracked like a whip. No, not enough. Marcus struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but determined. You want to know what's really wrong with this family? It's not your eyesight, Dad. It's your blindness to everything else. You can't see that Mom's been desperately trying to connect with you for years. You can't see that Victoria built her career 3,000 miles away because she couldn't stand living in your shadow. And you can't see that I've been drowning myself in bourbon because nothing I do will ever be good enough for the great William Hawthorne. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel could hear her own heartbeat, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sound of Maria preparing lunch in the kitchen. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Dad, is it true? What Marcus said about your eyesight? William stood motionless in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled devastation. Rachel watched him struggle with a decision that would change everything, continue the deception that was destroying his family, or trust them with the truth he'd been guarding so desperately. I had a stroke, he said finally, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. 2 years ago, I lost my sight completely. Victoria sank into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support her. A stroke? 2 years ago? Why didn't you tell us? Because I thought I could handle it. Because admitting weakness isn't something Hawthorne men do. Because I was terrified that if the business world knew, everything I'd built would crumble. Marcus let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Jesus, Dad, you think we care about your money more than we care about you, don't you? The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. No, Victoria said firmly, tears streaming down her face. We don't. We care about you. We've always cared about you. But you've never let us close enough to show it. Eleanor appeared in the doorway behind William, drawn by the raised voices. She took in the scene, her husband's rigid posture, Victoria's tears, Marcus's drunken devastation, and immediately understood what had happened. Oh, William, she said softly. You told them. They figured it out on their own. Marcus has been reviewing company documents. Victoria's fielding calls from worried investors. The whole charade was falling apart anyway. Eleanor moved to stand beside her husband, taking his arm in a gesture that was both supportive and protective. So what happens now? It was Victoria who answered, her voice carrying the steel that had made her successful in the cutthroat world of New York commercial architecture. Now we figure out how to protect this family and this company. Together. The board meeting's on Thursday, she continued, pulling out her phone. I'll fly back tomorrow and start damage control. Marcus, I need you to pull together all your research on the problem properties. If you're right about the environmental issues, we need to address them before they become public relations disasters. Marcus straightened, looking more alert than Rachel had seen him since she'd started working there. You want my help? I want your expertise. Dad was right about one thing. You know these properties better than anyone. The question is whether you can stay sober long enough to help us navigate this crisis. Marcus nodded, his hands already reaching for his phone. I can do that. I've been waiting 28 years for someone to ask. William stood in the middle of his family's sudden mobilization, looking lost and overwhelmed. Rachel stepped forward quietly. Sir, perhaps we should review your calendar for the week. If there are going to be changes to the business strategy, we'll need to adjust your meetings accordingly. He turned toward her voice with something that might have been gratitude. Yes, that would be helpful. As the family began to plan their strategy, Rachel realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. The moment when a group of people stopped pretending to be perfect and started figuring out how to be real. It was messy, complicated, and fraught with decades of accumulated hurt. But for the first time since she'd entered the Hawthorne mansion, it felt like a family. The real test would come on Thursday, when William would have to face his board of directors and decide whether to continue the deception or trust the business community with the same truth he'd finally shared with his family. The empire he'd built was about to face its greatest challenge. The question was whether the foundation of love and trust they were rebuilding would be strong enough to weather the storm. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made Atlanta feel like a steam bath, even in the air-conditioned confines of the Hawthorne Industries boardroom on the 32nd floor of the Peachtree Center. Rachel stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city sprawl beneath them while behind her, William paced with the restless energy of a caged predator. The board members will be seated in their usual positions, Rachel said quietly, reviewing her notes. Mr. Davidson, the chairman, will be at your 2 o'clock. Mrs. Chun, Victoria's mother-in-law, will be directly across from you. Mr. Morrison's representative will be at 10 o'clock, close enough to watch your every move. William's jaw tightened at the mention of Morrison. Ever since the Patterson reception, Charles Morrison had been circling like a shark, spreading whispers about William's declining capabilities while positioning himself for a hostile takeover. Remember, Victoria said from where she sat reviewing financial reports, we're not just defending your leadership. We're presenting a succession plan that shows strength and continuity. Marcus's environmental analysis could actually save the company millions. That's our opening. Marcus, looking more alert and focused than Rachel had seen him in weeks, spread a series of maps and reports across the conference table. True to his word, he'd stayed sober for 3 straight days, channeling his energy into the most comprehensive property analysis in the company's history. The Peterson site is just the tip of the iceberg, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. I've identified contamination issues at 4 different properties. But here's the thing. If we address them proactively, we can turn environmental remediation into a selling point. Green development is the future of real estate. Eleanor entered the boardroom carrying a silver tray with William's coffee and what looked like a thick folder. "The community leaders I've been working with want to meet with you," she said to William. "They've prepared a presentation about public-private partnerships that could transform how we approach low-income housing development." Rachel watched the family dynamics with amazement. In the 3 days since William's confession, they'd transformed from a collection of isolated individuals into something resembling an actual team. But the real test was about to begin. At exactly 10 a.m., the board members began filing into the room. Rachel had studied their files extensively. 12 of Atlanta's most powerful business leaders, each with their own agendas and alliances. Davidson, the board chairman, was William's oldest ally but increasingly concerned about company stability. Mrs. Chun, Victoria's mother-in-law, held significant voting power through her late husband's estate. And then there was Robert Morrison, Charles's younger brother, who joined the board 2 years ago with the stated goal of bringing fresh perspectives to family-owned enterprises. "William," Davidson's gravelly voice filled the room as he took his seat. "Thank you for calling this meeting. I think we all have some concerns to address." William moved to the head of the table with the careful precision Rachel had come to recognize, his hand briefly touching the back of his chair before sitting. "Gentlemen, ladies, I appreciate your time. I know there have been questions about recent business decisions, and I want to address those concerns directly." Robert Morrison leaned forward, his smile predatory. "Questions is putting it mildly, William. Half the business community is wondering if you're still capable of running this company effectively." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rachel watched Victoria's hands clench into fists, saw Marcus's jaw tighten with anger. "Meaning what exactly?" William's voice was dangerously quiet. "Meaning," Morrison continued, clearly enjoying himself, "that your behavior at public events has been erratic. You seem distracted, disconnected. Some of your recent property acquisitions show questionable judgment. People are starting to wonder if it's time for new leadership. People like your brother Charles?" Morrison's smile widened. "Charles has expressed interest in acquiring Hawthorne Industries, yes. He believes the company has tremendous potential that might be better realized under different management." The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Davidson raised his hand for silence. "William, I think we need to address these concerns head-on. The Peterson environmental issues alone could cost us $8 million in remediation," Marcus interrupted, standing up with his maps and reports. "But that's if we handle it reactively. If we take a proactive approach and turn it into a showcase for environmental responsibility, we could actually increase property values by 15%. Morrison looked annoyed at the interruption. "And you are Marcus Hawthorne. And I've spent the last 2 years analyzing every property this company owns, every deal we've made, every environmental concern that could affect our bottom line." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "The Peterson site isn't a disaster, it's an opportunity. Same with Brookhaven, Riverside, and the downtown complex." "Marcus," Morrison's voice dripped condescension, "I'm sure your father appreciates your enthusiasm, but perhaps we should leave complex business decisions to experienced professionals." "You mean like the experienced professionals who missed 4 major environmental issues that could have cost this company $50 million in lawsuits?" Marcus shot back. "Or the experienced professionals who didn't notice that proactive remediation could turn those same issues into competitive advantages." Victoria stood smoothly, her architect's training evident in how she commanded the room's attention. "The environmental analysis is just one example of the kind of innovative thinking this company needs. But more importantly, it demonstrates something that seems to have been forgotten in this discussion. This is a family business, built on the principle that success comes from understanding both the market and the community we serve." She moved to the presentation screen, clicking through a series of slides that showed property developments, community partnerships, and financial projections that made several board members sit up straighter. "Our mother has been developing relationships with community leaders throughout Atlanta," Victoria continued. "These partnerships don't just fulfill our corporate social responsibility. They provide access to development opportunities that our competitors don't even know exist." Eleanor rose gracefully, her southern charm masking nerves of steel. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent 3 years building trust with community organizations throughout this city. They've shared with me their vision for sustainable development that benefits both residents and developers. These aren't charity projects, they're business opportunities. Rachel watched the board members' faces, seeing the calculation behind their expressions. This wasn't the family dysfunction they'd expected. This was a coordinated presentation of strength and innovation. But Morrison wasn't finished. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice cutting through the presentations like acid. "But it doesn't address the fundamental question of leadership. William, can you honestly tell this board that you're capable of providing the kind of hands-on management this company requires?" The moment of truth had arrived. Rachel could see William's hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. This was his choice: continue the deception that was slowly destroying him and his family, or trust these business leaders with the truth that could either save or destroy everything he'd built. William stood slowly, his bearing still commanding despite the vulnerability Rachel knew he was feeling. 2 years ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent boardroom, "I suffered a stroke that left me completely blind." The silence that followed was profound and absolute. "For 2 years, I've been hiding this fact because I believed that admitting any physical limitation would be seen as weakness, that it would destroy confidence in my leadership and threaten the livelihoods of everyone this company employs." Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, a predatory satisfaction that made Rachel's skin crawl. "But what I've learned," William continued, "is that real weakness isn't in admitting your limitations. It's in being too proud to accept help when it's offered. It's in being so afraid of appearing vulnerable that you isolate yourself from the people who care about you most." He gestured toward his family. "My wife has been building community partnerships that could revolutionize how we approach development. My daughter has been managing crisis communications that have prevented this company from losing millions in investor confidence. My son has been conducting property analysis that could save us from environmental disasters while opening new markets." William's voice grew stronger with each word. "I may be blind, but I can still see what matters most. This company succeeds because of the people who believe in its mission, not because of one man's perfect vision. The question isn't whether I can see, it's whether we can work together to build something better than what any of us could achieve alone." The boardroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Then Davidson spoke, his voice thoughtful. "William, this explains a lot, but it also raises serious questions about disclosure, about fiduciary responsibility, all of which can be addressed," Victoria interjected, "with proper governance structures and transparency going forward. The environmental analysis alone justifies keeping current management," Mrs. Chun added quietly. "My late husband always said that the best business decisions come from understanding what others miss." Morrison looked around the room, realizing that the coup he'd been orchestrating was slipping away. "This is madness. You're talking about entrusting a multi-million-dollar company to a blind man and his dysfunctional family. We're talking about recognizing that strength comes in many forms," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the steel magnolia authority that had made her a force in Atlanta society for 3 decades. "And that this dysfunctional family just prevented your brother from stealing a company he could never have built himself." As the board members began to debate among themselves, Rachel realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the salvation of a business empire, but the birth of a new kind of leadership, one based on honesty, collaboration, and the radical idea that admitting weakness could actually be a source of strength. The outcome was still uncertain, but for the first time since she'd entered the Hawthorne mansion, Rachel believed that this family, and this company, might actually survive and thrive. The question was whether the business world was ready for that kind of transformation. The vote was closer than anyone had expected, 7-5 in favor of maintaining Williams' leadership, with a restructured management team and mandatory quarterly reviews. Morrison stormed out of the boardroom, muttering threats about shareholder lawsuits and incompetent governance, but the immediate crisis had passed. What nobody anticipated was the firestorm that would erupt when news of Williams' condition leaked to the press less than 24 hours later. Rachel arrived at the estate Friday morning to find a circus of news vans, reporters, and photographers camped outside the wrought iron gates. The local morning show was broadcasting live from the street, while a helicopter circled overhead like a mechanical vulture. Her phone had been buzzing since 5 a.m. with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Ms. Montgomery, is it true that William Hawthorne has been hiding a disability for 2 years? A reporter thrust a microphone through her car window as she waited for the gates to open. No comment, Rachel said, her hands gripping the steering wheel as cameras flashed around her Honda like strobes at a concert. Inside the mansion, she found organized chaos. Victoria was pacing the front parlor with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapid-fire to what sounded like a crisis management firm. Marcus sat at the dining room table with his laptop open, monitoring social media and news coverage with the intensity of a day trader watching stock prices. Eleanor stood by the window, her usual composure cracked but not broken. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution wants an exclusive interview, Victoria was saying into her phone. Tell them we're considering it, but we need editorial approval. No, absolutely not. Any interview happens here, on our terms, or not at all. William emerged from his study looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His usually perfect posture was slightly slumped, and Rachel could see the toll the stress was taking on him. Sir, how are you holding up? Like a man watching his life's work get dissected by strangers, he said grimly. Morrison leaked it, of course. Probably called the press the moment he left the boardroom yesterday. Marcus looked up from his laptop, his face grim. It's not just local news, Dad. CNN picked it up. Forbes is running a story about corporate deception and fiduciary responsibility, and the Atlanta Business Journal. He hesitated. What about the Atlanta Business Journal? They're calling for a federal investigation into whether you violated securities laws by not disclosing a material change in your health status. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Rachel had spent enough time around William to understand the implications. Federal investigations could destroy not just his reputation, but the company itself. Eleanor moved away from the window, her movements sharp with anger. 26 years of marriage, and this is how I find out what my husband has been going through? By watching it on the morning news. Eleanor, William started. No, William, not this time. Eleanor's voice carried a fury Rachel had never heard before. I stood by you yesterday. I supported you in that boardroom. But I will not be humiliated by learning about my own family's business from Kate Morrison at the country club, who took great pleasure in informing me that everyone knew about your condition except apparently your own wife. Victoria ended her call and turned to face the family. We need to control the narrative before it controls us. I've scheduled a press conference for this afternoon. Absolutely not, William said immediately. I won't turn this family into a spectacle. Dad, we're already a spectacle. The question is whether we're going to be victims or whether we're going to tell our own story. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted the argument. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, looking more flustered than Rachel had ever seen her. Sir, there's a gentleman here from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He says it's regarding potential disclosure violations and would like to speak with you immediately. The blood drained from William's face. Show him to my study. William, you should have an attorney present, Eleanor said quickly. The family lawyer's already on his way, Victoria added. Don't say anything until he arrives. As William prepared to face what could be career-ending federal scrutiny, Rachel found herself thinking about the man she'd first met just 2 months ago. Proud, isolated, determined to maintain control at any cost. That man would have faced this crisis alone, relying on lawyers and public relations firms to manage the damage while keeping his family at arm's length. But the man walking toward his study now was different. He paused in the doorway and turned back to his family. Whatever happens, he said quietly, I want you to know that yesterday, in that boardroom, was the first time in years I felt like I was part of something bigger than my own fear. The SEC investigator was a thin, serious man in his 40s named Agent Patterson, who spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. Rachel sat in the corner of the study, taking notes as requested, while the family attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Chun, no relation to the board member, guided William through the questioning. Mr. Hawthorne, Agent Patterson began, when you suffered your stroke in March 2023, Were you aware that your condition might be considered a material change requiring disclosure to shareholders? I was aware that any health issue could potentially affect investor confidence, William replied carefully. But you chose not to disclose it? I chose to continue running my company effectively while managing a personal medical condition. Agent Patterson made notes in a leather portfolio. Mr. Hawthorne, are you aware that Hawthorne Industries stock has risen 12% over the past 2 years, during the period when you were allegedly concealing this condition? The question seemed designed to trap him, but William's attorney leaned forward. Are you suggesting that my client's undisclosed medical condition somehow artificially inflated stock prices? Because the financial records show that company performance has actually improved during this period. That's precisely what makes this case interesting, Patterson replied. If Mr. Hawthorne was actually more effective as a leader while managing his blindness, it raises questions about what constitutes material information that requires disclosure. Rachel looked up from her notes, suddenly understanding the complexity of the situation. This wasn't just about William hiding a disability. It was about challenging the assumption that physical limitations automatically translate to professional incapacity. The interview continued for 2 hours, covering everything from medical records to board meeting minutes to specific business decisions made during William's period of concealment. Through it all, William answered with the careful honesty of a man who had finally decided that truth, however painful, was preferable to deception. When Agent Patterson finally left, he delivered a statement that was both ominous and oddly hopeful. Mr. Hawthorne, this investigation will take several weeks to complete. However, I will say that this case presents some unique challenges to traditional disclosure requirements. Your company's performance suggests that your condition may not have been as material as initially assumed. After the federal investigator departed, the family gathered in the living room to watch the news coverage of the scandal that was rapidly becoming a national story. The reports ranged from sympathetic to sensationalist, but the overall tone was one of fascination rather than condemnation. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to his laptop screen. The hashtag blind but not blind is trending on Twitter. People are sharing stories about successful professionals with disabilities who've been hiding their conditions out of fear. Victoria pulled up another news report on her phone. Business Insider is calling it the leadership redefinition of the decade. They're interviewing disability rights advocates who say your example could change how we think about corporate leadership. Eleanor, who had been silent for most of the day, finally spoke. William, I'm still angry with you for shutting me out for 2 years. But I'm proud of what you did yesterday in that boardroom. For the first time since I've known you, you chose truth over control. William sat quietly for a moment, processing the weight of the day's events. I may lose everything, he said finally. The SEC investigation could result in fines, criminal charges, forced resignation. Everything I've built could disappear. Or, Rachel said quietly, speaking for the first time since the morning's chaos began, you might discover that what you've built is stronger than you ever imagined. That it was never really about one man's perfect vision. It was about the vision itself and the people who believe in it. As evening fell over Atlanta, the Hawthorne family faced an uncertain future. The federal investigation would continue. The media attention would intensify. Business competitors would try to exploit the perceived weakness. But for the first time in 2 years, they would face these challenges together, as a family united by honesty rather than divided by secrets. The question was whether the business world, and the legal system, was ready to accept that strength could come in forms they'd never considered before. The empire William Hawthorne had built was about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. But so was his family's capacity for resilience, growth, and the kind of love that sees clearly even in the darkness. 6 months after the SEC investigation began, Rachel stood in the renovated community center in downtown Atlanta, watching William Hawthorne read Braille to a group of children whose eyes were wide with wonder. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had once hidden his blindness like a shameful secret was now teaching kids that different ways of seeing the world could be sources of strength rather than limitation. Mr. Hawthorne, how do you know what the words say just by touching them? Asked Maria, a 7-year-old whose grandmother worked in one of the Hawthorne apartment buildings. William's fingers moved across the raised dots with practiced ease. Every letter has its own pattern, Maria. It's like learning a secret code that only your fingers can read. Would you like to try? The months since the public revelation had been a whirlwind of challenges and unexpected transformations. The SEC investigation had concluded with a fine, significant but not devastating, and a requirement for enhanced corporate governance. More importantly, it had set a precedent that challenged traditional definitions of what constituted material information requiring disclosure. Rachel had watched the Hawthorne family navigate this period of intense scrutiny with a grace that surprised everyone, including themselves. Victoria had taken a leave of absence from her New York firm to help restructure the company's operations, bringing her architectural expertise to bear on accessibility improvements across all Hawthorne properties. Marcus had been officially promoted to Vice President of Environmental Affairs, his analysis having saved the company an estimated $30 million in potential environmental liabilities. Eleanor had emerged as an unexpected media darling, her combination of Southern charm and fierce intelligence making her a sought-after speaker on topics ranging from corporate social responsibility to supporting family members with disabilities. She'd used her newfound platform to advocate for workplace accommodations and community partnerships that benefited both businesses and residents. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation had been in William himself. M.S. Montgomery, a familiar voice called from across the community center. Rachel turned to see Dr. Matthews approaching, his medical bag replaced by a tablet and a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. "Doctor, how are you?" "Impressed," he said, watching William guide a child's small fingers across a Braille alphabet card. "When I first started treating William, I was worried he might develop depression or anxiety related to his vision loss. Instead, he's become one of the most psychologically healthy patients I've ever worked with." "What changed?" Dr. Matthews considered the question. "I think he finally stopped fighting a war he couldn't win and started focusing on battles where his skills actually mattered. He's discovered that being an effective leader has very little to do with physical sight and everything to do with vision in the metaphorical sense." The community center itself was a testament to that metaphorical vision. What had started as Eleanor's secret charitable project had evolved into a comprehensive partnership between Hawthorne Industries and 3 neighborhood organizations. The center offered after-school programs, job training, small business incubation, and, in a touch that made Rachel smile every time she saw it, Braille literacy classes for both children and adults. "Rachel." Marcus appeared at her elbow, slightly out of breath and carrying a folder thick with documents. "You need to see this." The quarterly reports came in, and the numbers are... He paused, shaking his head in amazement. "They're incredible." Rachel flipped through the financial summaries, her eyebrows rising with each page. "These can't be right. The company's outperforming last year by 18%. 21% if you factor in the environmental savings from the remediation projects. Turns out that being proactive about accessibility and environmental responsibility doesn't just prevent disasters. It actually attracts investors and tenants." Victoria approached them, her usually perfect composure slightly disheveled from spending the morning installing tactile signage in the lobby of a Hawthorne office building. "Are you two looking at the quarterly reports?" "Because I just got off the phone with our insurance company, and they're offering us a premium reduction for our accessibility improvements." "Premium reduction?" "Apparently, buildings with comprehensive accessibility features have lower accident rates and higher tenant satisfaction. Who knew that designing for inclusion actually reduces liability?" Rachel watched the siblings share a moment of genuine excitement and collaboration, thinking about how different this scene was from the bitter confrontations she'd witnessed just 6 months ago. The crisis had forced them to work together, but the success that followed had taught them that they were stronger as a team than any of them had been individually. "Ms. Montgomery," William's voice carried across the community center as the children's reading session concluded. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" She joined him by the large windows that looked out onto the renovated playground where community kids played alongside children from some of Atlanta's most exclusive private schools, another innovation that had emerged from the partnership between Hawthorne Industries and local organizations. "I wanted to thank you," William said quietly, "not just for your work over the past months, but for something more fundamental. Sir, for seeing me clearly when I couldn't see myself at all. For understanding that helping someone maintain their dignity isn't the same as enabling their denial." He turned toward her, his unseeing eyes somehow managing to convey warmth and gratitude. You could have taken the job, kept quiet about what you observed, and collected your salary while watching me destroy my relationships with my family. Instead, you chose to be honest, even when that honesty was uncomfortable. Rachel felt tears pricking at her eyes. You gave me a chance when nobody else would, sir. A woman from the mountains with no corporate experience, no connections, no qualifications except a willingness to work hard. You changed my life. We changed each other's lives, William corrected. The question is, what do we do now? It was a question Rachel had been avoiding. Her role as William's assistant had evolved dramatically over the past months. She'd become something between a family advisor, a corporate consultant, and a bridge between the Hawthorne world and the community organizations they now worked with. But she was also a woman who'd spent her entire adult life caring for others, and she was beginning to wonder what she might accomplish if she focused some of that energy on her own dreams. Actually, sir, I've been thinking about that. The community partnerships have been so successful that I think they deserve dedicated attention. Someone who understands both the business side and the community side, who can help expand this model to other cities. William was quiet for a moment. Are you talking about leaving Hawthorne Industries? I'm talking about starting something new. A consulting firm that helps companies develop authentic community partnerships. Eleanor's already agreed to be my first client. She wants to replicate this model in 3 other cities. And you'd be the president of this new company? President, janitor, and everything in between, at least at first. Rachel laughed nervously. It's terrifying and exciting and probably completely crazy. It's exactly what you should do, William said firmly. And I want Hawthorne Industries to be your first major investor. As the afternoon sun streamed through the community center windows, Rachel found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. 8 months ago, she'd been a desperate widow driving through a thunderstorm toward a job she'd taken out of pure necessity. Now, she was preparing to launch her own company with the backing of one of Atlanta's most respected business leaders. But more than that, she'd been part of something extraordinary. The transformation of a family that had almost destroyed itself through pride and fear into something stronger, more honest, and more connected than any of them had thought possible. Sir, she said quietly, what do you think your father would say about all this? About the company, the community partnerships, the way everything has changed? William was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful. My father built this company through sheer determination and an absolute refusal to show weakness. He would have been horrified by everything that's happened, the public disclosure, the vulnerability, the collaboration. He paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He also would have been wrong, because what we've built together is stronger than anything I ever could have created alone. As Rachel prepared to leave her position as William's assistant and step into the uncertain world of entrepreneurship, she realized that the greatest lesson she'd learned in the Hawthorne mansion wasn't about business or leadership or even family dynamics. It was about the courage required to let people see you clearly, not just your strengths, but your limitations, your fears, your need for help. And about the extraordinary things that become possible when we stop pretending to be invincible and start working together as the beautifully imperfect human beings we actually are. The Hawthorne Empire had not only survived its moment of truth, it had been reborn as something more honest, more inclusive, and more sustainable than its founder had ever imagined. And sometimes, Rachel thought, that's exactly what the world needs. Not more invincible leaders, but more courageous ones willing to show that strength comes in many forms. 1 year to the day after Rachel Montgomery first drove through the wrought iron gates of the Hawthorne estate, she found herself standing in the same spot, but everything had changed. The gates now bore a small bronze plaque reading Hawthorne Community Partnership Campus, and instead of intimidating barriers, they served as welcoming entry points to what had become a model for corporate community collaboration studied by business schools across the country. Rachel pulled her new car, a modest but reliable Toyota that she'd bought with her first profits from Montgomery Community Consulting, into the visitor parking area that had been carved from what used to be the estate's pristine front lawn. The change would have horrified the old William Hawthorne, but the man she'd come to know over the past year understood that true legacy wasn't about preserving perfect facades. It was about creating something that could grow and adapt and serve others. She'd returned today for 2 reasons. to attend the official dedication of the Hawthorne Institute for Inclusive Leadership and to deliver the final reports from her consulting firm's first major project, helping Hawthorne Industries replicate their Atlanta model in Birmingham, Nashville, and Charlotte. The mansion's front door opened before she could knock, revealing Eleanor in a cream-colored suit that somehow managed to look both elegant and practical. Her transformation over the past year had been as dramatic as anyone's, from a society wife relegated to charitable committees to a nationally recognized advocate for corporate social responsibility. "Rachel, darling, you look wonderful," Eleanor said, embracing her warmly. "How was the drive down from Nashville?" "Productive. The community center there is already at capacity, and the job training programs have a waiting list." Rachel handed Eleanor a thick folder. "The final implementation report for Phase 1. Your husband was right. The model is scalable." They walked through the mansion's familiar corridors, but these too had been transformed. The museum-like formality was gone, replaced by warmth and functionality. The walls now displayed photographs from community events alongside the ancestral portraits, and the marble floors were softened by colorful rugs created by local artists through Eleanor's Cultural Partnerships program. In what used to be the formal dining room, they found William hosting a meeting with representatives from 3 Fortune 500 companies who wanted to learn about the Hawthorne model. He sat at the head of a table that was now equipped with both traditional documents and Braille materials, leading a discussion about sustainable community engagement with the confidence of someone who discovered that his greatest strength had nothing to do with his physical sight. "The key insight," William was saying to his audience, "is that community partnerships aren't charitable giving with a business veneer. They're strategic investments that happen to have social benefits. When you help a community solve its problems, you create a stronger market for your products and services." Rachel watched him field questions from the corporate executives, marveling at how natural this kind of teaching had become for him. The man who'd once hidden his blindness like a deadly secret now spoke openly about adaptation, collaboration, and the business case for inclusion. Victoria appeared at Rachel's elbow, carrying a tablet loaded with architectural plans. "Rachel, perfect timing. I wanted to show you the designs for the expansion." She pulled up a series of renderings that showed the estate's grounds transformed into a multi-building campus with conference facilities, training centers, and residential spaces for visiting scholars. "The Birmingham model worked so well that we're getting inquiries from companies across the Southeast," Victoria continued. "Dad decided that instead of just consulting on individual projects, we should create a permanent institute where business leaders can come to learn about inclusive leadership practices." "And Marcus?" Victoria grinned. "Marcus is in his element. He's designed environmental sustainability protocols that are being adopted by companies that have nothing to do with real estate. Last month, he consulted with a manufacturing firm in South Carolina about reducing their carbon footprint while improving worker conditions. They found Marcus in what used to be the estate's library, now converted into a research center where he worked with a team of environmental consultants and community development specialists. His transformation from the family disappointment to a nationally recognized expert in sustainable business practices had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. "Rachel." Marcus looked up from a conference table covered with charts and graphs, his face bright with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found his calling. "You have to see this data from Nashville. The job training programs aren't just helping individuals. They're actually creating a more skilled workforce that's attracting new businesses to the area." He pulled up a presentation on his laptop, his movements confident and purposeful, a far cry from the drunk, defeated young man she'd first encountered. "Look at these employment statistics. The neighborhoods where we've implemented community partnerships are showing economic growth that's outpacing the rest of the city." As Rachel reviewed the data, she was struck by the mathematical proof of something she'd felt intuitively from the beginning, that helping people discover their strengths and potential wasn't just morally right, it was economically smart. The afternoon's official dedication ceremony took place in the mansion's back garden, which had been transformed into an amphitheater surrounded by plants chosen for their textures and fragrances rather than just their visual appeal. An audience of 200 included community leaders, business executives, disability rights advocates, and families from the neighborhoods where the Hawthorne partnerships had taken root. Rachel found herself seated in the front row next to Dr. Matthews, who'd become something of a celebrity in medical circles for his research on how purpose and community connection affect the psychological health of people with disabilities. A year ago, Dr. Matthews said quietly as they waited for the ceremony to begin, "I was worried that William might never psychologically adjust to his vision loss." Now he's become one of the most influential voices in the country on adaptive leadership. What made the difference? He stopped trying to hide his limitations and started leveraging his strengths. Turns out that someone who's learned to navigate the world without sight develops incredible skills in listening, pattern recognition, and collaborative problem solving. The ceremony began with Eleanor introducing the speakers, her voice carrying clearly across the garden without any of the nervous formality that had once characterized her public appearances. 12 months ago, this estate was a beautiful but isolated monument to individual achievement. Today, it's the headquarters of a movement that's proving every day that our greatest accomplishments come not from what we can do alone, but from what we can do together. Victoria spoke about the architectural principles of inclusive design, demonstrating how buildings created with accessibility in mind actually work better for everyone. Marcus presented environmental data showing how community partnerships could address both social justice and climate change simultaneously. Local community leaders shared stories about how the partnerships had transformed their neighborhoods. But it was William's keynote address that brought the audience to its feet. A year ago, he began, standing at a podium equipped with both traditional microphones and assistive technology. "I believed that admitting weakness would destroy everything I'd worked to build. I was wrong about almost everything except one thing: the work we do matters. How we treat our communities, our employees, our families, our environment. These things matter more than quarterly profit reports or stock prices or personal reputations." He paused, his unseeing gaze somehow managing to encompass the entire audience. "I spent 40 years building a company based on the principle that success comes from being stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than your competition. But the most successful year in my company's history happened after I stopped trying to be invincible and started learning how to be honest." Rachel watched the faces in the audience as William continued his speech, seeing tears, nods of recognition, and the kind of attention that comes when someone is sharing a truth that resonates deeply. This was what real leadership looked like, not the performance of perfection, but the courage to be authentic in service of something larger than yourself. As the ceremony concluded and the reception began, Rachel found herself in conversation with representatives from companies across the country who wanted to implement similar programs. Her consulting firm's calendar was already booked 6 months out, and she'd had to turn down speaking engagements at 3 major business conferences. "Ms. Montgomery," a voice behind her said. Rachel turned to find a young woman in her 20s, professionally dressed, but with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was still new to the corporate world. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Premier Staffing Agency, the same firm that placed you here a year ago. I wanted to thank you for what you've accomplished, because it's changed how we think about matching candidates with positions." "How so?" "We used to focus on matching qualifications with job requirements. But what you've shown us is that sometimes the most transformative hires come from understanding character, potential, and the capacity for growth rather than just previous experience." As the reception wound down and the sun began to set over Atlanta, Rachel found herself alone with the Hawthorne family in the garden, where she'd first begun to understand the depth of their dysfunction and pain. "So," William said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that had replaced the estate's original formal outdoor furniture, "what's next for Montgomery Community Consulting?" 3 new cities next year, a partnership with a foundation that wants to fund similar programs nationally, and apparently a book deal with a publisher who thinks this story needs to be shared more widely. "A book?" Eleanor asked, her eyebrows rising. "About us." "About the principle," Rachel clarified. "About what happens when people and organizations stop trying to appear perfect and start focusing on being authentic and effective." Marcus raised his glass of sweet tea. He'd been sober for 10 months now, channeling his addictive personality into an obsession with environmental sustainability data. To authenticity, effectiveness, and the woman who showed us the difference between the two. As they toasted the future, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She'd come to the Hawthorne estate as a desperate widow looking for a job that would help her survive. She was leaving as an entrepreneur with a growing business, but more importantly, as someone who discovered that her greatest strength lay in helping others discover theirs. The Hawthorne family had learned that vulnerability could be a source of strength, that asking for help could be an act of courage, and that real success was measured not by what you could accumulate, but by what you could create in partnership with others. "You know," William said quietly as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, "my father always told me that a man's worth was measured by what he could build on his own. But I think he was wrong about that too." "What do you think it's measured by?" Rachel asked. William smiled, reaching over to take Eleanor's hand in a gesture that had become natural again after years of distance. "By what grows long after he's gone. By whether the people whose lives he touched are stronger, kinder, and more capable because they knew him." As Rachel drove away from the estate for what might be the last time as a regular visitor, she thought about the bronze plaque on the gates, the transformed mansion, the families whose lives had been changed by job training programs and community partnerships. But most of all, she thought about the truth that had emerged from a year of crisis, growth, and transformation. That the greatest gift we can give each other isn't the illusion of perfection, but the courage to be real, to ask for help when we need it, and to offer our authentic selves in service of something bigger than our individual fears and ambitions. The Hawthorne Empire had been rebuilt on a foundation not of pride and isolation, but of honesty, collaboration, and the radical idea that strength comes not from what we can hide, but from what we're brave enough to share. And sometimes, that makes all the difference. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you watched all the way to the end, comment, "I watched to the end," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's very exciting for you.